I'm Henny B, and welcome to the World War I Stories podcast, where history comes alive through the voices of those who lived it. Some scenes in these stories may be too graphic for sensitive listeners, so listener discretion is advised. Today's episode, Under the Parisian Sky. Emile loved Paris, with its bustling streets and lively cafes, where the scent of fresh bread mingled with the laughter of friends. Yet, as September 1914 unfolded, an unspoken tension hung in the air, casting a shadow over the city's vibrant charm. Europe had erupted into war, and the German army was marauding its way through the French countryside, drawing ever closer to Paris. Yet, Emile went about his daily business, attempting to ignore the threat that was on every Parisian's mind. He had the best job anyone who loved the city could wish for. He drove a taxi. Each day he navigated the winding streets and hidden corners of Paris, discovering parts of the city that many never had the chance to see, and for this, he was beyond thankful. Emile awoke to the enticing aroma of breakfast wafting into the bedroom of the small apartment he shared with his wife, Eve. The savory scent of sizzling bacon, mingled with the sweetness of fresh fruit, made his mouth water and stirred his anticipation for the day ahead. As he entered the small room that housed their living area and kitchen, he was greeted by Eve's radiant smile. "Good morning, my love," he said as he glided across the room to her side. "And good morning to you," she replied with affection. Emile sat down at the small table by the window in the corner of the room. The place was small, but affordable for them. It was cramped and musty, but for a couple in their late 30s with no children, it was just enough. Eve placed 2 plates on the table and sat across from him. "No coffee?" Emile asked. Eve apologized and rose to pour him a cup of thick, dark coffee, just the way he liked it. She sat it on the table near his plate and retook her seat at the table. "Emile," she started as he ate, "I've been thinking." "What of, my love?" "I know you love Paris, but we're getting older. What do you think of Honfleur? It's on the coast, great weather, they have taxis." "Eve, we've talked of this many times before. I love Paris, I don't want to leave, and we won't be leaving." His response was terse and breathed of finality. "Aren't you concerned about the Germans?" "The war?" she asked. "I'm not, and neither should you. The Germans will never reach Paris." "And what makes you think that Honfleur would be immune to the war?" he replied calmly. He had grown tired of these discussions over the last few years, but their frequency had intensified over the last few weeks. "I'm not so convinced. When I go to market, I hear people talk. They say that the Germans are getting closer. It concerns them." She was not smiling now. "They don't know what they're talking about." He was annoyed by the conversation and wanted it to end. "Emile," she said as she reached across the table and took his hand, "I'm scared." He smiled at her as best he could. It was hard lying to her. He knew the German army was advancing and he was scared too. But telling her this would only exasperate her fears. "My love, there's nothing to worry about. I drive diplomats and government officials around. They tell me there's nothing to worry about," he lied. The truth was that these officials and diplomats were sounding the alarm all over the city. Emile stood from the table, kissed Eve, and walked out the door. He lived just a few blocks from the depot where his taxicab was housed, and he still mulled over everything as he strode to work. He opened the rusty hinged door to the depot and glanced around the dark, dingy garage. The atmosphere seemed different this morning. The usual chatter he had often heard, chatter about unsavory or rude customers and family matters, had been replaced by chatter about danger and orders. He spotted Pierre, another driver and friend. "Why does everyone seem to be so worked up? What's going on?" he asked. Pierre said nothing, which in itself was unusual. Instead, he pointed across the room where 4 other drivers stood reading a piece of paper that had been nailed to the wall. Emile crossed the dimly lit garage to read the notice. "Notice to all drivers. Due to a rapid German advance, you are all hereby requested to answer the call of duty. You're hereby ordered to report with your vehicle to the East Station at 0800 hours to transport troops to the front. Standard rate plus government compensation shall accompany this action. A knot had formed in Emile's stomach as he read the notice. Was the situation worse than even he had anticipated? Bad enough that the military had to enlist taxi cabs to retrieve soldiers at the train station and get the soldiers to the front? He thought of Eve and how she would react to this development. He shook his head and sighed at the thought of him telling her how things weren't as bad as she was hearing. There was no way she wouldn't hear about this. He looked at his timepiece. It was 7:30. Without another word to any other driver or dispatcher, he walked to his car and drove towards the East Station. When he arrived, Emile was taken aback by the sight before him. A long line of taxis snaked along the street, lining in front of the main terminal and beyond, in both directions. It became clear that his garage was not the only one responding to the call. There must have been hundreds of cabs gathered, their drivers united by a shared sense of duty and unease. He parked about 3 blocks from the main platform at the end of a seemingly endless line of vehicles. Emile had never realized there were so many taxis in Paris, and the sheer number filled him with a mix of anxiety and determination as he prepared to face whatever lay ahead. Over the next hour, more and more taxis rolled in, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. While other drivers chatted animatedly, sharing stories and speculating about the day's events, Emile kept to himself. He felt a knot tightening in his stomach, and the laughter and banter around him only amplified his unease. He didn't need the input of others to worsen the turmoil in his mind. Instead, he focused on the steady rhythm of his breathing, trying to quell the rising tide of anxiety that threatened to overwhelm him. The clamor of the drivers was suddenly replaced by the sound of a train, the air brakes making a loud whooshing sound as the train came to a stop at the main platform. The doors on the train cars seemed to open simultaneously, and the platform soon filled with soldiers marching in quiet solidarity towards the vehicles parked along the roads. The drivers, who had been so animated, were now silent in anticipation. Emile and the other drivers watched as a commanding officer, his presence both quiet and authoritative, directed soldiers to vehicles, 3 men per car. He moved with purpose, stopping to speak briefly with each driver before moving on. It was a half hour before the officer finally approached Emile. Emile stood nervously with the commanding officer before him. "What's your name, sir?" the officer asked. Emile Rousseau, sir." "Mr. Rousseau, I am Captain Dupont." He paused to motion towards 3 young soldiers standing behind him. "You are being asked by your country to take these 3 men 22 miles east of Paris. From there, they will march, with others, the other 3 miles to the front. This is a very necessary action, and your country is grateful to you for it." Before Emile could respond, the captain briskly walked away, leaving him standing there, a mix of pride and dread swirling in his chest. The weight of the responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders as he turned to face the soldiers, their youthful faces reflecting a mix of determination and fear. It was another hour and a half before the cars began to roll out of Paris and head towards the German lines. Under normal circumstances, Emile would have felt a thrill of excitement, a smile spreading across his face as he took in the sights of his beloved city. But this time was different. Instead of bustling streets alive with merchants hawking their wares and citizens going about their daily lives, he saw a somber scene. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual vibrancy replaced by a heavy stillness as people gathered to watch the seemingly endless procession of taxicabs departing the city. Their expressions were a mix of concern and resignation, a stark reminder of the gravity of the moment. Emile's heart ached as he realized that this was not just a journey, it was a departure from the familiar, a step into the unknown. The drive was slow going and the soldiers made no attempt at small talk. Emile guessed that none of the 3 were older than 22. He attempted to speak to the one in the passenger seat. "This is making me nervous." "You're nervous?" the soldier chuckled quietly. "I mean, obviously not as nervous as you 3 fellows probably are," Emile replied, a wry smile on his face. One of the soldiers in the back seat replied, "We're all nervous, sir. Nobody ever thought that the Germans would get this close to Paris." "This is true. Emile replied. I was just telling my wife this morning that there was nothing to fear. The soldier in the passenger seat looked Emile up and down curiously. So you lied to her? Because we have all known of the German advance for weeks. What you call a lie, I call, well, a lie. Sometimes we protect our loved ones from the truth so they can breathe a little easier, Emile replied. Guess a little white lie is just as useful in marriage as it is in warfare, right, fellows? The third soldier chimed in. This made the three soldiers and even Emile laugh. Over the next 2 hours, with the ice broken, Emile and the three soldiers talked about the war, their lives, and their dreams. He learned that all three boys were 19 years old, all three were from small villages, and none of them had met before that day. Just as they settled into a comfortable rhythm of chatter, the first loud boom of artillery fire echoed in the distance, jolting them back to the stark reality of their mission. The laughter faded, replaced by a heavy silence as they each grappled with the weight of what lay ahead. Traffic slowed to a crawl, and soon Emile noticed taxicabs passing them, headed back in the other direction. 20 minutes later, they reached the front of the line. The three soldiers exited the vehicle, merging into the throng of hundreds milling about the barren fields. He realized that even if he tried, he wouldn't be able to find them again. Emile stared into the distance where pillars of black smoke billowed into the air, mingling with the gray clouds that loomed ominously above the battlefield. The sharp crack of gunfire and the sporadic thud of shells echoed in his ears, each sound a stark reminder of the hell unfolding just beyond his sight. It must be hell up there, he murmured to himself, a chill running down his spine. A man in a neatly pressed French uniform approached his vehicle. Turn around here, sir. Head back to the station. Many more troops need to get here, and thank you for your service today. Emile nodded, turned around, and headed back. Emile made the trip 4 more times, each time carrying 3 soldiers to an unforeseen fate at the front. Each time, the conversation was polite. The soldiers expressed their nervousness, and Emile expressed his gratitude for their service. Each time he reached their destination, he was in awe of the number of troops who were lining up to march the rest of the way. The sun was setting as Emile rolled into Paris after his last trip to the front. He could see the spire of Notre Dame in the distance glimmering in the orange glow of the setting sun. He decided to pull over and watch the sunset. As he sat at the side of the road, he was overcome with an immense sense of grief. For him, the sun was setting for the day. For some of those boys he took to the front, the sun was setting on their lives, and he drove them there. He sat quietly, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The vibrant colors of the sky felt like a cruel reminder of the joy and hope that had been extinguished for those young men. He thought of their faces, some filled with determination, others shadowed by fear. They had climbed into his taxi, each with their own dreams and stories, and now they were headed into the unknown. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Emile felt a deep ache in his heart. He had been so focused on the task at hand, on getting them to their destination, that he hadn't taken the time to ask those boys the most important question of all. I never asked their names, he said to himself, the words heavy with regret. In that moment, as darkness began to settle over the city, Emile realized that he would carry that sorrow with him forever. I never even got their names. Thank you for listening to World War I stories, where history comes alive through the voices of those who lived it. I'm Henny B, your host and storyteller. Please like and subscribe, and maybe even leave a review for us wherever you find your podcasts. And join us again for more World War I stories.